Tell me what your life was like before you died.
I grew up in suburban Minneapolis area and went to college and went to grad school for art. I was working as an archaeologist before I went over to Iraq. I was a civilian employee of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and I was hired to be a construction representative, which basically means kind of babysitting construction contracts, going out to the sites and checking them over. I had, luckily, 4 really fabulous Iraqi engineers who knew exactly what they were doing, and they were my eyes and ears in the field largely, and they really kept track of the projects day to day in the field. I liked being over there. It was fascinating to me. I grew up in a church, in a Presbyterian church, and I kind of just wandered away from that in my 20s. And I've always been interested in psychic things, psychic phenomena. I remember even as a little tiny kid, like maybe 4 years old, sitting in church and staring at someone and thinking, scratch your ear, scratch your ear, scratch your ear, until they would scratch their ear. So, I mean, I played around with stuff ever since I was little. I would have dreams and then they would later happen and things like that. I kind of got more serious about it in my 30s, maybe 10 years before I went to Iraq. So when we went outside camp, outside the wire, we would travel in an armed convoy. So on this day, I had 2 colleagues with me, or maybe we had 3 colleagues with me, and only 2 of us could travel in one vehicle because we also had a driver and a guard in each truck. So we had a 4-vehicle convoy. We had a lead truck and the 2 principal trucks with all of us Corps of Engineers people in it, and a gun truck in back. And we had visited a few construction sites, and it was the end of the day. It'd been a long day. So I was kind of leaning my head on the door handle, half asleep, and our vehicle hit an improvised explosive device in the road. The instant that, or maybe before, I don't know, the instant that it exploded, I left my body. The book that I wrote goes into a lot of detail about my perceptions of my experiences, but in a nutshell, I found myself standing on a little stage, and there were thousands of beings all around me, kind of like a stadium. I immediately knew where I was. I knew what I was doing. I wasn't disoriented. I knew what had happened. I knew what was going on. And I just started downloading information to these beings. And we had a little back and forth. I said I wasn't interested in going back, and they're like, well, what if you did this? And I thought, oh yeah, okay. I'm easily swayed. And even in the afterlife, yeah, you want to go to Iraq? Sure. Hang up the phone. Oh my God, what have I done? Yeah, so I agreed to go back. We communicated. I mean, it's all kind of, the communication is not even, I wouldn't even call it telepathic. I would call it kind of conceptual. It's instantaneous and it's complete. Anyway, then I call it blinking because the movement is so quick. I blinked to another environment, which was, I describe it as a sort of velvety blackness where I really didn't have a form anymore. I was kind of an organization of energy, centered on my awareness. First, there were 2 other beings there kind of tuning up my organization of energy. And then I had, I guess, a kind of a version of a life review. And then I went into a deep rest state. And I don't know how long I was in that. I mean, there's no time in that state. And eventually came out, blinked again. I could see all 4 of us in the truck. And I could also perceive that all of that seen as organizations of energy. So our bodies were organizations of energy, and the truck was an organization of energy. And everything was very fluid because, energy is fluid. We perceive things as solid form, but actually they're simply organizations of energy. Even if you break down particles farther and farther and farther, what you end up with is just energy. Anyway, so I was playing around with different injuries, and eventually I set the injuries that I wanted, that would set me up for the things that I wanted to do or how I wanted to experience myself or things of the world. And then I blinked back to that big gathering, and we kind of talked about or communicated about some things that I had agreed to do. Then I blinked again, and I was standing right next to the truck, and I was with about 8 other beings, and we were all talking about what I had agreed to do, but talking about it kind of on a different level. And then when I'm standing next to the truck with these other 8 or 9 beings, we were discussing things more like from the ground level. You know, things can look very different from management level and from if you're the one pounding the nails, right? And then when we were done talking about that, I blinked and I popped. There was an audible pop in my head, and I was back in the truck. The truck was still rolling down the road. My eyes were still closed, but I knew exactly what had happened. I was with 2 other beings, and we thought from that perspective that this was hilarious. We just thought this was so funny. We'd chop off my arm and then my right arm, and then watch me try to figure out how to write and do everything the rest of my life with my left hand. And oh my God, we were laughing so hard. This is what people are talking about when they say Council of Elders. So could this have been a Council of Elders? Sure. In a sense, I recognized all those beings. These weren't like relatives or old friends, or they were beings functioning in a different capacity. I do know that some of them had lives in bodies, but they weren't in bodies now. And it felt like maybe their time in bodies, they'd already done that. Maybe they were finished with that, but still had an interest in this reality. I think that we put very specific boundaries on this reality. We say, when you're in a body, you're in this reality. When you're not in a body, you're not in this reality. But I think that the boundaries are much more diffuse than that. I think you can certainly be out of a body and still be participating in this world, interacting with this world on different levels or in different ways. And I think these beings had some interest in humanity. I'll put it that way, in humanity. And I would say also in other consciousnesses or other kinds of being that we often overlook or don't consider to be conscious. Animals, plants, rocks, the wind, clouds, water. I went to the healing environment. You know, it's been a while since I've written my book. I think about it as this happened. You come back into a body and you have to organize it in linear time. So I'm going to say from the deep rest environment, I blinked to the healing environment, which is where I could see it's like I had like a 45-degree angle down. I was hovering above the whole desert scene with the blown up truck and us inside the truck. And I was kind of doing the equivalent of waving a hand, and I would set different injuries in my body. And then I would see, in one instant, I would see my whole life as it would happen if I had that injury. So I would wave my hand and I would make the hole in my head bigger and give myself some brain damage, and then see a flash of how the rest of my life would go. So I had my right heel was broken and a chunk of shrapnel was in there. Both of the bones in my forearm were shattered, and some of the wrist bones were broken. All the bones on the right side of my face were broken. I had a skull fracture. It's kind of redundant, but then I had a hole was blown into my skull here, and there was shrapnel in the frontal sinus. There was shrapnel in both eyes. I think they took a little bit out of that eye. A lot of damage to my right eye. The retina eventually came detached, and it was tattered. They did reattach it. I do remember days when the pain was just so bad. I couldn't even think straight. I couldn't even move. But I also remember a lot of times just finding things very funny, just finding it really hilarious that I couldn't even get out of bed, and finding it hilarious that people kept walking in my room and just giving me gifts, because it was right before Christmas, and lots of really sweet, wonderful people go to Walter Reed and take gifts. I say that I never laughed so hard as when I was in Walter Reed. They were just really great doctors and people who were nurses who were willing to laugh at me about what could have been considered traumatic or really dire, you know? Well, the way I talk about that is that feeling of love is so natural and so pervasive that it's really only noticeable when you don't have it. So when I think about when I return myself to these places, which I can still do, I can return there. And I can put my attention on what does that mean? What does that feel like? Is there love there? Of course it's there. It can't not be there. That's the very essence of everything. It's here too. We simply don't acknowledge it, or we don't pay attention to it, or we aren't opening ourselves to it. Or, you know, as soon as you believe that we're separate from it, you're going to have the experience of being separate from it. But what if you said to yourself, wait a minute, this is the very essence of me. Not love as an emotion, but love as a state of being. Love as a state of being is the very essence of everything that exists. So as soon as you believe that and allow for it, you're going to start to experience it. Even here, you don't have to go somewhere else to experience it.